In 1918, Germany formally protested that the United States was using a weapon too inhumane for war. This weapon wasn't poison gas, a flamethrower, or a bomb. It was a simple hunting rifle. 20 years later, in the Pacific, Japanese soldiers feared it more than any other American weapon. This is the story of the Winchester M1897 Trench Gun, the rifle that changed jungle combat forever and became a legend among the Marines. Stay until the end to discover why Japan offered special rewards for capturing only this weapon. The story of the Winchester M1897 Trench Gun begins not on a battlefield, but on the American plains of the late 19th century. John Moses Browning, perhaps the greatest firearms designer in history, was obsessed with creating a reliable and fast-firing repeating rifle. Browning was born in 1855 in Ogden, Utah, the son of a gunsmith. By the age of 7, he was already working in his father's workshop, cleaning guns and learning basic mechanics. At 13, he manufactured his first functional weapon using scrap metal found in the family's storage shed. He was clearly a prodigy. In 1897, after years of experimentation, Browning finalized the design that would change everything, the Winchester Model 1897. It was a pump-action, 12-gauge shotgun with a capacity of 5 cartridges plus 1 in the chamber. But it had a unique feature that would make it legendary decades later. The M1897 had no trigger disconnector. This meant that if the shooter held the trigger down while pumping the action, the weapon would fire automatically as soon as the chamber closed. A skilled shooter could fire all 6 rounds in under 2 seconds. It was devastating at short range. Winchester marketed the M1897 primarily to hunters and farmers. It was robust, reliable, and relatively inexpensive. Thousands were sold to civilians who needed protection against wild animals or for hunting birds. No one imagined it would become a weapon of war. The weapon had another remarkable feature: brutal simplicity. The mechanism was straightforward, with few moving parts. It could be disassembled and cleaned quickly, even by users without technical training. And it could function in conditions that would render more complex weapons inoperable. The M1897 weighed approximately 3.6 kilograms unloaded. The barrel was 51 centimeters long in the standard version, but Winchester offered variations. The tubular magazine under the barrel held 5 12-gauge cartridges, and the pump action was smooth and reliable. For years, the M1897 remained simply an excellent civilian rifle. Sheriffs used it, hunters loved it, stagecoach guards carried it. It was a common American tool, not particularly noteworthy in the vast firearms market. Then came World War I. In 1917, the United States entered the European conflict, and the army immediately faced a terrible problem: trench warfare. The trenches were narrow, labyrinthine, and full of blind corners. Long-range rifles were useless in these conditions. Soldiers needed something for close-quarters combat. Someone in the War Department had a radical idea. What if we used hunting rifles? Specifically, the trusty Winchester M1897. The suggestion was initially ridiculed. Rifles were for hunting ducks, not for modern warfare. But the desperate situation demanded creative solutions. The Army ordered militarized versions of the M1897. Winchester added a bayonet compatible with the Springfield M1903, a heat shield on the barrel, and a leather carrying handle. The M1897 trench gun was born, and its debut in the war would be so brutal that it would generate international protest. No one knew it yet, but John Browning had created something that would terrify enemy soldiers on 2 continents throughout 2 worlds. Was the first Winchester M1897 trench guns. Arrived in France in March 1918. American soldiers received them with skepticism. Many had hunted with similar rifles at home, but using a hunting weapon in combat seemed amateurish, almost embarrassing. This skepticism evaporated the first time trench guns were used in actual combat. During a trench-clearing operation near Belleau Wood, a platoon of Marines equipped with M1897s faced German soldiers entrenched in a complex network of defensive positions. The trenches were a claustrophobic nightmare. Narrow passages 2 meters deep, blind corners every few meters, makeshift bunkers, and virtually non-existent lighting. Conventional rifles were slow and inaccurate in those conditions, but shotguns were perfect. A Marine named Sergeant Daniel McCarthy would become famous for his skill with the trench gun. In a post-action report, he described a typical encounter. "We turned the corner of the trench, and there were 6 Germans less than 5 meters away. I fired 6 times before they could raise their weapons. It took maybe 2 seconds. The psychological effect was as devastating as the physical one. Each 12-gauge cartridge contained 9 pistol-sized lead pellets. The short-range dispersion was lethal. A single discharge could hit multiple targets or cause catastrophic injuries to a single target." German soldiers began to fear the distinctive sound of the Winchester rifle's pumping action. It was unmistakable. The metallic clack-clack followed by a deafening bang. Some Germans would try to surrender immediately upon hearing that sound, preferring prison to facing the rifle. But the brutal effectiveness of the trench gun caused international controversy. In September 1918, the German government lodged a formal protest through neutral diplomatic channels. They claimed that the rifles caused unnecessary suffering and violated the Hague Convention. The German protest was technically inconsistent, considering that Germany itself used flamethrowers and poison gas. But it touched on a real philosophical debate about the nature of human weapons. Rifle wounds were particularly horrific. Multiple impacts from large projectiles caused massive trauma. The United States categorically rejected the protest. The Secretary of State declared that rifles were perfectly legitimate for military use and that the U.S. would continue employing them. Furthermore, they warned that any American soldier captured with a rifle would receive standard prisoner of war treatment, or there would be retaliation. The controversy only increased the legendary status of the trench gun. American newspapers published stories about the rifle the Germans fear. Recruits specifically requested rifle training. The weapon that had been met with skepticism became a symbol of American ferocity. When the armistice was signed in November 1918, trench guns had proven their undeniable value in close combat. The Army kept thousands in stock, anticipating their usefulness in future conflicts. They were absolutely right. The next time the Winchester M1897s roared into battle would be in an even more brutal environment, the deadly jungles of the Pacific against an even more determined and fanatical enemy. And there they would become truly legendary. On December 7, 1941, the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor dragged the United States into World War II. Within weeks, the Japanese Empire conquered vast stretches of the Pacific, the Philippines, Malaya, Indonesia, Burma. The offensive was swift, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable. The United States faced an unprecedented military challenge, fighting across thousands of Pacific islands, each covered in dense jungle and defended by Japanese soldiers determined to fight to the death. It was the kind of war for which the American Army and Marines were unprepared. The Pacific jungles were hostile environments beyond imagination. Suffocating heat of 35–40 degrees Celsius with humidity close to 100%. Vegetation so dense that visibility was often reduced to a few meters. Tropical diseases decimated troops, and ambushes were constant. Japanese soldiers were formidable adversaries. Trained in infiltration tactics and night combat, they were masters at using terrain to their advantage. Hidden bunkers, interconnected tunnels, deadly traps, and above all, a fanatical determination to fight to the last man. Japanese tactics preferred silent infiltration, followed by brutal surprise attacks at extremely short ranges. They frequently attacked at night, when American numerical advantage and superior equipment were minimized. Combat quickly degenerated into bloody hand-to-hand chaos. Standard rifles like the M1 Garand were excellent weapons, but they had limitations in jungle combat. Long and heavy, they were difficult to maneuver in dense vegetation and at short distances. Their accuracy was less important than volume of fire. It was then that someone remembered the trench guns from World War I. Thousands of Winchester M1897s had been stored in depots for 20 years. They were old but functional, and perhaps they were exactly what the Marines needed for jungle combat. In February 1942, the Marine Corps initiated a program to reissue rifles to troops in the Pacific. The M1897 rifles were removed from stock, inspected, refurbished, and sent forward. Along with them were sent thousands of rounds of .20 buckshot ammunition, 9 8.4mm lead pellets per round. The first unit to receive rifles in significant numbers was the 1st Marine Division. Preparing for an operation on an island called Guadalcanal, veteran Marines immediately recognized the potential value of the rifles. Young recruits needed convincing. Shooting demonstrations quickly changed minds. An instructor placed 6 human silhouette targets in a semicircle with a radius of 3 meters. He fired all 6 cartridges from the M1897 in less than 3 seconds, hitting all 6 targets. The firepower was impressive, but nobody really knew how the rifles would perform in real jungle combat. Testing weapons in a training field was one thing. Using them against determined and skilled Japanese soldiers in a hostile environment was completely different. The Marines who landed on Guadalcanal would soon find out, and what they discovered would change jungle warfare doctrine forever. The Winchester M1897, the old hunting rifle, was about to become the most feared weapon in the Pacific. On August 7, 1942, the Marines landed on Guadalcanal, initiating the first major American offensive in the Pacific. The island was considered secondary, but its airstrip made it strategically critical. What was supposed to be a quick operation turned into a brutal 6-month campaign. The first few days were relatively calm. Marines captured the airfield with little resistance, but then the Japanese counterattacked fiercely. And it was in the savage combat that followed that the Winchester M1897s proved their deadly worth. The Battle of the Tenaru River, on August 21, 1942, was the baptism of fire for rifles. Approximately 900 Japanese soldiers launched a suicidal night attack against American positions. They attacked in dense waves, shouting and firing, attempting to overwhelm defenders through sheer force and ferocity. Sergeant John Basilone, who would later receive the Medal of Honor, was among the defenders. His unit included several Marines armed with M1897s. He described the battle in a post-action report. They came in en masse, too close for machine guns to be effective, but the rifles were perfect. Trench guns transformed the battle. At close range, 10-15 meters, each shot hit multiple attackers. The sound of the rifles pumping and firing rapidly was incessant, and the psychological effect on the attackers was devastating. Japanese soldiers began to hesitate when they heard that characteristic sound. Following Tenaru, field reports began to highlight the exceptional effectiveness of shotguns. One official report noted, 12-gauge shotguns are extraordinarily effective in close-quarters combat. One man with a shotgun is equivalent to 3 with rifles in engagements under 20 meters, but the M1897s weren't without their problems. The extreme humidity of the jungle caused rust to spread quickly. Mud and sand clogged the mechanisms, and the waxed paper cartridges, designed for hunting in temperate climates, swelled and disintegrated in the tropical humidity. Marines developed obsessive maintenance techniques. They cleaned their rifles multiple times a day. They covered them in heavy oil. Some improvised waterproof covers using pieces of canvas. A rifle that worked was a rifle that kept its owner alive. Regarding ammunition, Marines discovered that fresh cartridges were essential. Ammunition stockpiled for decades frequently failed. The Corps accelerated production of new cartridges specifically for tropical environments, using moisture-resistant brass cases instead of paper. Specific tactics for shotguns emerged. Marines discovered they were devastating for bunker clearing. A man with an M1897 could clear a fortified position faster and with less risk than an entire team with rifles. They were also excellent for ambushes and perimeter defense. Japanese soldiers began to develop a morbid respect for rifles. Captured diaries specifically mentioned American weapons that fire many times rapidly. Some Japanese soldiers mistakenly believed they were portable machine guns. When the Guadalcanal campaign ended in February 1943, rifles had established themselves as an essential weapon for jungle combat. Requests for more units flooded headquarters, but production of the M1897 had ceased in 1920. The Army needed an alternative. Winchester quickly developed the Model 12, an improved rifle based on the M1897, but thousands of older M1897s remained in service, preferred by many Marines who trusted in their proven simplicity and reliability. As the war in the Pacific progressed through 1943, the Japanese adapted their tactics. Realizing they could not win in daytime combat against superior American firepower, they became masters of night infiltration. And it was in this environment that the Winchester M1897 rifles became truly legendary. The Japanese night attacks were terrifying. Soldiers silently infiltrated American lines, closing in within inches of positions before attacking with bayonets, swords, and grenades. In total darkness, amid confusion and panic, defenders often shot their own men. Shotguns dramatically changed this dynamic. In darkness, long-range accuracy was irrelevant. What mattered was massive firepower across a wide arc. And in that, no weapon surpassed the M1897 with buckshot. Corporal Mitchell Page, another Medal of Honor recipient, described defending a position against a night attack on Guadalcanal. You couldn't see anything. You could only hear movement in the vegetation. With a rifle, you had one shot, and if you missed, they were right on top of you. With a shotgun, you aimed at the sound and fired. 9 projectiles covered a wide area. You were almost certain to hit something. The Marines developed a technique called fan defense. Men with rifles were positioned at key points in the perimeter. When infiltrators were detected, the riflemen fired in a fan pattern, creating a deadly zone that was virtually impossible to cross. The M1897's rapid rate of fire was crucial. Japanese infiltrators often attacked in groups of 3 or 4 men. A rifleman could engage one target at a time. A sniper with an M1897 could eliminate an entire group in 2 seconds. Almost mythological stories emerged. A Marine named Anthony Casamento supposedly defended an isolated position all night against waves of Japanese attacks, using only his M1897 and ammunition boxes. When dawn broke, more than 20 enemy bodies were scattered in a semicircle around his position. Japanese officers began issuing specific orders regarding American rifles. Captured documents contained instructions such as, avoid close engagements with enemies wielding short-barreled weapons that fire multiple projectiles. Some commanders offered rewards to soldiers who captured intact rifles for study, but the Japanese respect for rifles went beyond tactical effectiveness. There was a deep psychological element. The sound of the M1897, the distinctive pumping followed by the thunder of the discharge, had become associated with imminent and inevitable death. Soldiers who survived rifle encounters carried trauma. Marines who carried rifles developed an almost mystical reputation. They were called trench sweepers or riot gunners. Often volunteers, they were chosen for their calm temperament and ability to function in chaotic close-quarters combat. Riflemen's training was intensive. In addition to basic marksmanship, they practiced instinctive shooting, aiming and firing without careful sights. They repeatedly trained to remain calm while targets advanced rapidly. And above all, they learned to keep their rifles functioning in the most adverse conditions. In 1944, as Marines advanced through the islands of the Central Pacific, Tarawa, Saipan, Peleliu, the rifles were there. On every island, in every jungle, on every dark night, the distinctive sound of the Winchester M1897 was synonymous with American Marines fighting for survival. As the war progressed, Marines in the field began modifying and adapting their Winchester M1897 rifles to optimize performance in specific Pacific conditions. These unauthorized modifications often violated military regulations, but proved so effective that commanders turned a blind eye. A popular modification was to saw the barrel to lengths of 35-40 centimeters, instead of the standard 51 centimeters. Shorter barrels were easier to maneuver in dense vegetation and tight bunkers. The increased dispersion at short range was seen as an advantage, not a disadvantage. Some Marines also removed the entire stock, replacing it with an improvised pistol grip. This transformed the M1897 into an extremely compact weapon that could be carried and fired with one hand, while the other held a flashlight or grenade. It was physically punishing. The 12-gauge recoil was brutal without the full stock, but devastatingly effective in emergency combat. Experimentation with ammunition was also common. While 00 buckshot, 9 8.4mm spheres was standard, some Marines preferred 00 buckshot, 6 9.1mm spheres for greater stopping power. Others used solid slugs to penetrate fortifications or cut through dens. Vegetation, one particularly creative innovation, was mixed cartridges. Marines would alternately load buckshot and slug rounds into the magazine. This allowed them to engage both personnel, buckshot, and fortified positions, slug, without needing to reload. The technique required careful memorization of which type of cartridge was in the chamber. Unit armorers, unofficial mechanics who kept weapons running, developed remarkable expertise. They learned to polish metal surfaces to better resist rust. They created special lubricant mixtures that worked in tropical humidity. Some even fabricated makeshift replacement parts when official supplies were unavailable. Maintaining rifles became almost a ritual. Marines cleaned them obsessively, often multiple times a day. After a patrol or combat, the first thing they did was clean their rifle thoroughly before even eating or sleeping. A malfunctioning rifle was a death sentence. Tactical techniques also evolved. Marines developed duo tactics, where two men worked as a team, one with a rifle for medium engagements, the other with a shotgun for close cover. This partnership was especially effective on patrols through hostile territory. In urban combat, which became relevant as Marines fought through towns and cities in the Philippines, rifles were irreplaceable. Clearing buildings was a tactical nightmare. Every door, every corner was a potential deadly ambush. Marines with M1897s developed a dynamic entry technique, kicking down doors and immediately firing into the environment. Intelligence officers noted that Japanese soldiers often surrendered more quickly when facing Marines with visible rifles. There was something about the M1897's distinctive profile, with its short barrel and exposed action, that was immediately recognizable and terrifying. The reputation of shotguns reached the American public through war correspondence. Reports describe Marines equipped with deadly shotguns clearing Japanese bunkers. Photos of grim-faced Marines carrying their customized shotguns appeared in magazines like Life and the Saturday Evening Post. The Winchester M1897 had transcended its role as a military weapon. It had become a symbol of the ferocity and adaptability of the American Marines in the Pacific. And the war was far from over. In 1944 and 1945, the Pacific Campaign reached its bloody climax. Marines fought through some of the war's most brutal battles: Iwo Jima, Okinawa, the recapture of the Philippines. And in each of these hellish campaigns, the Winchester M1897 rifles proved their worth time and again. The attack on Iwo Jima in February-March 1945 was particularly brutal. The entire island was a fortress, miles of interconnected tunnels, reinforced concrete bunkers, hidden artillery positions. Every meter of territory cost American blood, Rifles were essential for clearing tunnel complexes. Marines developed a specific technique, a fragmentation grenade thrown into the tunnel, immediately followed by a Marine with an M1897 entering and firing at any survivors. It was extremely dangerous but effective. Sergeant Darrell Cole, who posthumously received the Medal of Honor on Iwo Jima, was known for his skill with a rifle. Witnesses described him leading assaults on fortified positions, using his M1897 to eliminate defenders at near hand-to-hand range before throwing demolition charges. Okinawa, from April to June 1945, was even more terrible. The battle lasted 82 bloody days, with massive casualties on both sides. And it was in Okinawa that one of the most notable incidents involving rifles occurred. During the defense of an isolated position, a small group of Marines was surrounded by a substantially larger Japanese force. For 3 days, they withstood constant attacks. Of the 8 Marines, 3 carried M1897 rifles. When they were finally rescued, more than 60 dead Japanese soldiers were scattered around the position, most apparently victims of rifle fire. The Japanese area commander reportedly offered a special reward, promotion, and leave to any soldier who captured one of the multi-shot weapons intact. This confirms, through captured documents, the morbid respect the Japanese had developed for rifles in the Philippines, where Marines and soldiers fought through densely populated urban areas. Rifles faced a new challenge. Urban combat demanded careful discrimination between combatants and civilians. The rifle's wide dispersion pattern was a disadvantage in situations where accuracy was critical. Experienced marksmen adapted to using solid slugs in urban situations, reserving buckshot for jungle combat and bunker clearing. This required remarkable discipline, switching ammunition types under combat stress, while maintaining mental control of which cartridge was loaded. Stories of individual feats with rifles continued to accumulate. A Marine named Mitchell Red Cloud Jr. reportedly single-handedly defended a machine gun position after his entire team was killed, using his M1897 to repel successive waves of attackers until he succumbed to his wounds. Combat fatigue was a serious concern. Marines fought for weeks or months without adequate rest, in conditions that ravaged both body and mind. But even exhausted, those carrying rifles had to maintain constant attention to the upkeep of their weapons. As 1945 progressed and it became clear that Japan was losing the war, the fighting paradoxically intensified. Japanese soldiers fought with the desperation of men who knew they were facing final defeat. And in these last desperate battles, the M1897s continued their deadly work. When the atomic bombs were dropped in August 1945 and Japan finally surrendered, the Winchester M1897 rifles had served in virtually every major Pacific campaign. Estimates suggest that thousands of Japanese soldiers were killed by these rifles over 4 years of brutal war. When World War II ended in August 1945, the Winchester M1897 rifles that had served so fiercely in the Pacific faced an uncertain fate. Thousands were worn down by years of brutal use in harsh tropical conditions, but many were still perfectly functional. The Marine Corps, recognizing the proven value of the rifles, decided to keep them in active service. The M1897s were returned to the United States, inspected, refurbished when necessary, and stored. Newer models, such as the Winchester Model 12 and the Ithaca Model 37, were entering service, but the older trench guns remained available. Veterans who had used the M1897 in the Pacific had an almost emotional relationship with the weapons. Many tried to buy them back upon demobilization, but military regulations made this difficult. Some mysteriously disappeared from inventories, presumably taken home by veterans who couldn't part with the weapons that had saved their lives. The reputation of shotguns in the Pacific influenced civilian policing. Police departments across the United States began adopting shotguns for riot control and high-risk situations. The M1897 was particularly popular for its proven robustness and reliability, but the story of the M1897 in military service was far from over. In 1950, when the Korean War began, Marines once again found themselves in close-quarters combat against a determined enemy. And once again, the old Winchester rifles were taken out of storage. In Korea, rifles proved their lessons from the Pacific remained relevant. During the brutal Battle of Chosin Reservoir in the winter of 1950-51, where Marines fought against waves of Chinese attackers in temperatures of 40 degrees below zero, the M1897s continued to function when more modern weapons froze. One remarkable aspect was that 30-year-old rifles were still reliable. John Browning's simple mechanisms, built with generous tolerances and quality steel, proved to be virtually indestructible. While modern automatic rifles jammed in extreme cold, the M1897s kept firing. World War II veterans who had used rifles in the Pacific were now using them again in Korea, this time as experienced sergeants and lieutenants. They were teaching a new generation of Marines the same techniques they had learned a decade earlier. Institutional knowledge was being passed on. The Vietnam War brought the M1897 back to jungle combat, its original domain. Although most units used more modern rifles like the Ithaca 37 or Remington 870, some older M1897s were still in service, particularly among special forces and advisors. In Vietnam, rifles were used extensively for ambushes, base defense, and tunnel operations. The Viet Cong tunnels were particularly dangerous, claustrophobic networks where combat occurred in total darkness at distances of only a few meters. Tunnel rats, soldiers specialized in exploring tunnels, often preferred rifles. A Vietnam veteran described the tunnel encounter: "You're crawling in complete darkness with only a small flashlight. Suddenly there's movement ahead. There's no time to think, only to react. The rifle fills the entire tunnel with projectiles. It's your only chance to survive." Ironically, some of the M1897s used in Vietnam were the same weapons that had fought in the Pacific 25 years earlier. There were rifles with arsenal markings from 1918, weapons that had served in 3 separate wars across half a century. The longevity of the M1897 in military service is an extraordinary testament to Browning's design. While most weapons become obsolete in a decade or two, the Winchesters have proven their worth through 3 major conflicts in radically different environments. The Winchester M1897 Trench Gun was finally officially retired from American military service in the 1970s, ending an operational career of more than 50 years. But its legacy continued to influence military doctrine and popular culture for decades. The tactical impact of rifles in the Pacific led to fundamental changes in how militaries thought about close-quarters combat. The concept of CQB, close quarters battle, developed in part based on lessons learned from the M1897 modern special forces, including Navy SEALs and Army Rangers, still train extensively with combat rifles. The principles established by the Marines in the Pacific, massive firepower in a wide arc, speed over accuracy, ability to engage multiple targets, remain valid. The M1897 has also become a cultural icon. It has appeared in countless war films, video games, and works of fiction. Its distinctive silhouette, exposed barrel, pump action, wooden handguard is instantly recognizable to firearms enthusiasts. Collectors pay premium prices for authentic M1897 trench guns, especially those with proven military markings. Examples in original condition can be worth tens of thousands of dollars. Some with a documented service history in the Pacific are considered priceless historical treasures in military museums throughout. The United States display the M1897 as part of their World War II collections. The National Marine Corps Museum in Quantico, Virginia, has a section dedicated to rifles, including examples that served on Guadalcanal, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Veterans who used the M1897 in the Pacific Many now 90 or older still speak reverently about the weapons. In veterans' reunions and oral history interviews, they describe the rifles as tools that saved their lives time and again. A 95-year-old veteran interviewed in 2020 said that rifle weighed maybe 4 kilos. But when you're in the dark jungle and you hear Japanese people approaching, it feels like it weighs nothing. It was an extension of yourself. You didn't think, you just pointed and fired. And it never missed. The influence of the M1897 extends beyond military applications. Modern pump-action rifles for police and home defense owe much to Browning's design. The concept of the rifle as a short-range defensive weapon was largely established by the reputation of trench guns, modern firearms. Manufacturers still produce replicas and updated versions of the M1897. Companies like Norinco in China produce near-exact copies. Inland Manufacturing in the United States recently released a modernized version while retaining key features of the original design. Historical rifle shooting competitions often include categories for the M1897. Competitive shooters demonstrate the slam fire technique, holding the trigger down and pumping rapidly. That makes the M1897 unique. Skilled shooters can empty the weapon in less than 2 seconds, just as Marines did decades ago. The weapon also influenced video game design. Popular games like Call of Duty, Battlefield, and Medal of Honor include versions of the M1897, often portrayed as an extremely powerful weapon at close range. Millions of players have virtually experienced what Marines actually experienced. For the military community, especially the Marines, the M1897 remains a symbol of adaptability and brutal effectiveness. It represents an era when Marines literally used any tool available to complete a mission, improvising and innovating under pressure. When reflecting on the impact of the Winchester M1897 Trench Gun on the Pacific War, we are confronted with a fascinating paradox. A weapon designed in 1897 for civilian hunters became one of the most feared military weapons of the 20th century. A tool initially rejected as unsuitable for modern warfare proved devastatingly effective. The story of the M1897 teaches us profound lessons about the nature of military innovation. The most effective weapons are not always the most technologically advanced or the most expensive. Sometimes, simplicity and reliability trump sophistication. Browning's 1897 design performed better in the jungles of the Pacific than many weapons decades newer. Adaptability was key. The M1897 wasn't designed for tropical jungle combat. It wasn't designed for bunker clearing or defense against night attacks. But Marines adapted the tool to the specific needs they faced. That adaptability of both the weapon and the men who used it was crucial. The psychological aspect cannot be underestimated. Japanese soldiers were exceptionally determined and courageous adversaries, willing to fight to the death even in impossible situations. But rifles terrified them in a way that other weapons could not. There was something viscerally terrifying about multiple large projectiles in lethal dispersion. Captured Japanese documents reveal this psychology. A 1944 Japanese tactical manual included a specific section on American multi-spread weapons, advising soldiers to avoid close engagements when these weapons were present. This is remarkable. Japanese commanders literally altered tactics specifically because of the rifles. The fact that Germans in World War I and Japanese in World War II both developed a specific fear of the same rifles is extraordinary. There are not many weapons in history that have generated this kind of terrified awe from multiple adversaries over decades. Economics was also a factor. An M1897 cost a fraction of the price of a modern automatic rifle. Ammunition was cheap and widely available. Maintenance was simple enough for any soldier to perform. In a war of attrition that consumed massive resources, this economy had real significance. But perhaps the most fascinating aspect is how the M1897 exemplifies a fundamental military principle: the right weapon for the right situation. In long-range combat in open terrain, rifles were useless. But in dense jungles, dark tunnels, night combat, precisely the conditions that defined the Pacific War, they were unparalleled. This raises an interesting question about military planning. Militaries often prepare for the next war based on the last one. In 1941, the American Army was equipped primarily for conventional combat in open terrain, modeled on the experiences of World War I in Europe. Nobody was prepared for the jungles of the Pacific. That thousands of antique rifles were in storage was almost accidental. They had been kept primarily because disposing of them was troublesome, not because anyone foresaw a future need. But this accidental redundancy proved life-saving when the Pacific combat environment made rifles essential. There is irony in how a rejected weapon became indispensable. In 1918, Germans protested that rifles were inhumane. In 1942, American military personnel initially viewed them as inadequate relics compared to modern automatic weapons. Both assessments proved completely wrong when confronted with the reality of combat. This suggests that established military expertise sometimes errs spectacularly in assessing weapons' effectiveness. Experts in Washington in 1942 couldn't truly understand the conditions Marines would face on Guadalcanal. Only actual combatants in real conditions could determine which weapons performed best. The practice of allowing Marines in the field to modify their rifles, sawing off barrels, altering stocks, experimenting with ammunition, violated regulations but proved essential. The best innovators were often sergeants and corporals with direct combat experience, not engineers in offices. The history of the M1897 also illustrates the importance of institutional knowledge. World War I veterans passed on lessons about rifle use to a new generation. In World War II, these veterans then taught Marines in the Korean War. This continuity of knowledge across generations was crucial. For Japanese soldiers who faced the rifles, the experience was a nightmare that defied their training and expectations. They had been taught that spirit and determination could overcome superior technology. But against Marines with M1897s in nighttime jungle combat, spirit was not enough. Diaries and letters from captured Japanese soldiers reveal profound fear. One soldier wrote, "The American guns firing so often are impossible to avoid. You hear the sound, and you know death is coming. There's no way to protect yourself." This psychological terror was as significant as physical lethality. The legacy of the M1897 extends to this day. Every time special forces use shotguns to storm buildings, every time police officers carry shotguns for high-risk situations, every time someone chooses a shotgun for home defense, they are following a precedent set by the Marines in the Pacific with their Winchester M1897s, the weapon that the Germans called inhumane in 1918, and that the Japanese feared in the Pacific was, in the end, just a tool. It wasn't morally good or bad. It was effective for a specific purpose under specific conditions. But in the hands of determined Marines fighting for survival in hellish jungles, it became something legendary. John Moses Browning died in 1926. Decades before his invention achieved legendary status in the Pacific. He never knew that the shotgun designed for duck hunters would become one of the most feared combat weapons in history. But his genius for simple, robust, and effective design has proven timeless. The Winchester Model 1897 Trench Gun didn't win the Pacific War on its own. But in the hands of courageous Marines facing relentless adversaries in impossible conditions, it gave them a crucial advantage that saved countless lives. For soldiers who carried it through jungles, tunnels, and dark nights, it was more than a weapon. It was a reliable companion, a lethal protector, and often The difference between life and death, and for Japanese soldiers who faced it, it was something simpler and more terrifying. It was the worst nightmare come true. The clack-clack sound, followed by the thunder of the discharge, meant that death had arrived, swift and inevitable. The rejected rifle had become exactly what its critics swore it would never be, a devastatingly effective weapon of war. And in the process, it changed how close-quarters combat was conducted forever. ND.